Good evening or good morning, depending where you are in the world. I would like to talk about global value chain today. To begin, I would like to talk about some trade statistics. It serves as a motivation for my talk about the global value chain. It is also interesting by its own. Let's first look at some statistics from the U.S. Okay, in this chart, we can see trade balances of the U.S. economy. And we divide trade into four different areas. One is trade in agriculture, hunting, forestry, and fishing. The other is trade in mining goods. The third type is the trade in manufacturing goods. Then the fourth type is trade in services. And in this chart, we can see that the U.S. enjoys a surplus in trade in services. Okay, that's the red line. It's above the horizontal line. And so that indicates a surplus in service trade. However, the U.S. At the same time experiences a trade deficit in manufactured products, as is illustrated by the blue line at the bottom. And this deficit in manufactured product trades is actually somewhat large. It's about 4% of GDP. So there is a lot of talk about this trade deficit of the U.S. economy. There are many different reasons for this large trade deficit in the manufactured products. One reason is that the U.S. Is very good at producing services, especially financial services, business services, etc. The U.S. also exports education, exports research and development products. These are all service trade. Then because a country often determines what it produces according to the comparative advantage of its production. Since the U.S. is very good at producing services, so the U.S. enjoys a surplus in service trade. On the other hand, since a lot of people engage in service production, so fewer people engage in manufactured products production. So that's one of the reasons why the U.S. Experiences a deficit in manufactured products trade. And still, that's not the whole story. Another reason is that U.S. is the supplier of international reserves currency. U.S. dollars are accepted by many countries, and a lot of central banks purchases U.S. dollars as reserve currency. And because other central banks get U.S. dollars, in order for them to be able to get the U.S. dollars, they have to sell something to the U.S. The country of that central bank has to sell something to the U.S. In order to get the dollars as the reserves currency. That's the most important reason why the U.S. economy experiences a trade deficit. These are all normal. However, not a lot of people understand this. So there is a lot of debate, a lot of dispute about the U.S. trade deficit. And one of the targets of this debate, obviously, is China, because China enjoys a large surplus in manufactured products trade with the U.S. Let's look at this table. This table shows the share of U.S. trade deficit in manufactured product with different partners. And here, China is one of these. The fourth column from the right is China's number. If we focus on the 2017 number, okay, there China export accounts for about 56% of U.S. trade deficit in manufactured products. So that's large. Because China takes up such a high share of U.S. trade deficit, naturally it becomes the center of debate. There are a lot of accusations thrown against China. So I would like to talk about some of these issues. Okay, so here, if you just focus on this table alone, then you would think that China is exporting a lot. China would enjoy a large trade surplus with the rest of the world. However, that's not the case at all. Here, let me show you the decomposition of GDP in China. So GDP is the total amount of final products produced in a country. So here in China, we produce about 100 trillion yuan of GDP a year. And of all the products, some is consumed by domestic households. Okay, so here, if you look at, let me see, the blue line, that's the share of GDP that goes into household consumption. It's about 40% of GDP. So Chinese households consume about 40% of what is produced in China. Then we also invest a lot. That's capital formation. The gray line here indicates capital formation as a share of GDP. That's more than 40%. So that those two accounts for more than 80% of GDP. Then government spending. Government also consumes. It's about slightly less than 20% of GDP. How much does China export in net? Because China does export a lot. At the same time, China also imports a lot. So in order to look at the net effect, we need to look at the net export. Actually, net export is only a very small share of GDP in China. It used to be very large. If you look at the light orange line on the chart, you can see that in 2007, net export was 9% of GDP. That was very large. However, after 2007, that share has been gradually declining. And in 2018, it was about 0.7%, less than 1% of GDP. In 2019, it went up slightly. It's about 1.4% of GDP. That's a tiny share. So when you look at China's trade with the rest of the world, with all the countries put together outside of China, all the countries outside of China put together, China only enjoys a tiny, tiny proportion of trade surplus. So I don't think it's fair to blame China for the large trade deficit in the U.S. because China's trade with the rest of the world is basically in balance. It's just that the U.S. is very special. It experiences a large deficit with the rest of the world. It happens that China's export accounts for a very large share of U.S. trade deficit. Then why is Chinese trade such a large share of U.S. deficit? Let's look at this slide. Let's use an iPhone as an example. Okay, I'm going to use these research results produced by Dedrick, Linden, and Kramer. They are professors in the U.S. They wrote this paper, and according to their paper, an iPhone 7 retails for about $649. And the retail profit is huge, is about $280. That's entirely earned by the company of Apple. Okay. Then the other is the cost. Then there's some taxes, etc., etc. But besides the retail profits are made by Apple, then you have factory costs. And this is because Apple is assembled in China. So this total cost, factory cost, about $237, is recorded as China's export to the US. So this is a large number. For every iPhone 7 sold in the US, on the record, China enjoys a trade amount of $237. However, how much of the $237 is actually produced in China? That actually quite a small number is actually produced in China. The reason is, to produce iPhone, China has to purchase a lot of intermediate inputs from other countries. For example, China purchases chips produced by other countries. China purchases possibly the screen from other countries. Then with all these inputs from other countries, Chinese workers assemble them in China. Then the Apple iPhone is sold to the US. So value added produced in China should be the export value, that's the $237, minus all the costs of the intermediate inputs from other economies. How much is the cost of intermediate inputs from other economies? Let's look at the number reported by these authors. Out of the $237, okay, about 69 came from the US. Actually, US exports some computer chips, some iPhone chips to China, then it's assembled in China, then it's sold back to the US again. So out of the materials, $69 is imported from the US. Then about $68 is imported from Japan, $48 is imported from Taiwan, then some unidentified sources, $22, Korea, $60, only about $8.46 is actually value added produced in China. So an iPhone is sold at more than $600, only $8.5 is actually produced in China. The rest is produced in other parts of the world, and the profits is mostly enjoyed by the US company. Okay, so this is an example of why on the surface, China enjoys a large trade surplus with the US. But if you look from China's perspective, China actually didn't gain that much. Of course, China very much appreciates the opportunity to engage in this production process so that it creates employment opportunities. Okay, so this is not a small number. Cell phones and other household goods, it was about $70 billion of business. That's the biggest, in 2007, China's biggest exports to the US is given on this slides. Cell phone and other household products is one of the largest items. Recently, China is moving up the value chain. For iPhone 7, only about $8 was produced in China, but for iPhone X, a lot more is produced in China. Still, China's value added is only about 1/4 of the total export value recorded in the books. So this, of course, is a fairly extreme example. It shows that if you look from the US perspective, if you only look at the official trade data, then the US seem to suffer a large trade deficit. But if you look from the Chinese perspective, then China doesn't really enjoy that much of a surplus in this trade. So that this is an example of one product. Then economists are spending a lot of time trying to do a more general analysis, looking at all products and services, and looking at how these numbers can be decomposed in a way so that we can see the true picture more clearly. So that's a few colleagues of mine in the US. They wrote a very interesting paper. They developed a methodology to do the decomposition. Okay, what they did was I'm going to use a few slides to illustrate what they did. It's a little bit involved, so please pay very close attention. So in order to understand this, let's imagine that we divide the world into three parts. This first part is China. Okay, we are interested in understanding better the trade balances between China and the US. So the first part, obviously, should be either China or the US. Here, let me say, the first part is China. The second part is the US. So we are looking at this bilateral trading relationship, so you have to have these two parties. Then we lump the rest of the world together. We call it the third countries, okay? So we divide the world into three parts. Trade goes on among these three parties. Okay, within each country, what you produced is used either to satisfy domestic final demand, for example, household consumption, domestic investment, government expenditure. So these are final domestic demand. Then part of what you produced is exported. So we decompose each country's GDP into two parts, final demand and export. Export actually should be net export. Okay, so for China, we have final demand and export. For US, final demand and export. For third country, the same. Then the very thick horizontal line with the narrow from China to the US represents the total export that's recorded in the books. Okay, it's a huge number. It's a huge number. However, not everything there truly represents what's actually produced China and consumed in the US. So what we are really interested in is what's actually produced in China that is consumed either by households or by the government or by enterprises in the US. So that's the true picture. So we are trying to get at this. So that's so we use a term called DVA, direct, DIR, that represents domestic value added produced in China that goes directly to the US for final demand, to satisfy final demand. Okay, so that's the true thing. We are interested in this. Okay, however, this is very different from the total export number at the top. I didn't put the numbers there, probably I should have, but you can imagine the thick line represents a large amount. The DVA part, a thinner line, represents a smaller amount. So that's part of the trade. Then there is a set of green arrows. Okay, it went from China to the US, then from the US to the third countries. What does it mean? China produces something, it's exported to the US, then US uses as an intermediate input, produce something else, then sell it to a third country. So in the US export to the third country, part of it is produced in China. So that part is Chinese export to the US, but it's not consumed in the US. So it doesn't affect the US that much. Okay, so we call this value added produced in China, but it's indirectly exported to the third country. Okay, so this is part of the export of China, but it's not consumed in the US. So this is another part, the second part. Let's look at a few other items. The third part is China exports something to the US, then US uses as intermediate input to produce something else, then sell it to China back. Okay, so that part of Chinese export actually eventually comes back to China. So it shouldn't be counted as the real export from China to the US. So we call this return domestic value, so RDV. So that part should be taken out of the total export amount in order to get the true picture. Then another one. So earlier when we talked about value added, we said that it should be the value of export minus the cost of intermediate inputs. Where does the intermediate inputs come from? Well, it could have come from the US. Let's look at the set of blue arrows. Okay, I use MVA to represent those arrows. It's something exported from the US to China, for example, a chipset. Then it's assembled into an iPhone. It's sold back to the US. So it made a round trip. That shouldn't be counted as Chinese export. So that's MVA, okay? That's part of the intermediate inputs. Intermediate inputs can also come from a third country. So let's look at the orange lines, arrows here. So the orange arrow goes from a third country, which exports something to China. For example, the glass to make the cover of the iPhone. Then it's assembled in China, it's sold to the US. So this part is not actually produced in China. Some third country sold something to China, then China assembled it and sent it to the US. So it should be counted as export of the third country to the US, okay? So this is another possibility. So all these are part of the GDP accounting. Sometimes it should be accrued to China, sometimes it should be accrued to the US, sometimes it should be accrued to the third country. It shouldn't be all accrued to the third country, to China. Then there are other possibilities that involves double counting. The other possibilities that involves double counting. For example, something is exported from China to the US, then US did something on it, then sold it back to China. China did something again on it, then sell it back to the US. So here, it's a very elaborate pattern. The product goes from China to the US, from US to China, then from China to the US again. In the trade data, this will be recorded twice, okay? Because first time it's exported to China, it's recorded in the books. The third part, when China buys it back from the US and sells it again to the US, it enters the book again. So it's counted twice. This should be corrected. And so this kind of double counting should be subtracted from the trade data. Then there are other types of double counting, For example, US exports something to the third country. For example, US designs a chipset, then the chipset is made in another economy, then that chipset is sold to China. China uses that chipset to produce an iPhone, it sells back to the US. So something makes a triangular trip. Initially, it's produced by the US, then finally it's consumed by the US. So there is no net export or import in the part of the US. On the part of China, there is no net export or import either. On the part of the third country, no net export or import either. So this kind of thing is recorded in the trade data. So it's double counted, okay? So this is finally another possibility. Okay. The third country exports something to China. China exports it to the US, then US sells it back to the third country. So the thing makes a round trip. No country enjoyed any trade surplus or suffers any trade deficit either. But all these numbers into the official trade data. So because of these double counting, because of these intermediate inputs that is incorrectly accrued to the wrong country, so the official trade data really doesn't tell the true story. So some economists are trying to correct this, so that we can get a truer picture, a clearer picture about what's really going on. So this is the result of their work. I think it's very impressive. It involves a lot of data work, dirty work, very difficult, but very illuminating, actually. So let's look at, this is the trade, US-China trade of computer, electronic, and optical equipment. Okay, so this iPhone will be included here. Let's look at the 2014 data. So here we have 3 years worth of data. Let's focus on the 2014 data. So in terms of total value of export from China to the US, it's a huge number. It's $166 billion. $166 billion. Okay, how much it is actually produced in China instead of buying intermediate inputs from other countries and reassemble it? How much value added is produced in China? Then it's consumed by a foreign country. Only 46% of that is actually produced in China. Then it's actually consumed by either somebody in China, in the US, or somebody in the third country. Out of this 40%, 6%, 40.5% is consumed by the US, then 5.5% is sent to a third country. So for 166 billion US dollars of Chinese export in computer, electronic, and optical equipment, only about 76 billion is actually produced in China, then consumed by either the US or the third country. Okay, intermediate inputs is about 41.5%. That's why what's the value added produced in China is only 46%. So if you look at these numbers, then you would have to say that the raw data of trade hugely exaggerates the trade surplus between China, the trade imbalance between China and US. We just looked at China export to the US. We found that only 46% of China export recorded in the official statistics was actually produced in China and consumed outside of China. Then we can also look at the opposite direction, US exports to China. And again, the same product category. US exports about $25 billion of products in this category to China. But out of this $25 billion, 74% was actually produced in China. For the other direction, it's only 46%, but for the US export, it's 74%. And the US companies uses relatively little inputs from other countries when they produce goods to export to China. Intermediate inputs from other countries was only 4.1%. So these are very asymmetric. China exports to US was hugely exaggerated, but US export to China is much less amplified by the intermediate inputs. Okay, so but still, even after taking out these intermediate inputs, even after we only look at the value added, China still enjoys a substantial trade surplus. So where does the trade surplus come from? Let me show you this table. Let's look at the 1990 number. In 1990, 30 years ago, Japan accounted for 49.4% of the US trade deficit. So Japan was a major exporter to China. Then for Asian newly industrialized economies, the four East Asian tigers, they accounted for 25.7% of US trade deficit. So together, Japan and the four East Asian tigers accounted for 75%, 3/4 of US trade deficit. So China only accounted for 10%. So that was 30 years ago. But now, the roles between Japan and the four Asian tigers and China switched. Now China accounts for 56%. Japan only accounts for 10%. And the four East Asian tigers only account for 1.2%. So what does these numbers mean? What do these numbers mean? They mean that originally, a lot of products were sold directly from Japan to the US. So Japan enjoyed large trade surplus with the US. Same thing was true for the four Asian tigers. Then after 30 years, the production activities are rearranged. They are moved from other Asian economies to China. So the Japanese are producing some very high-tech inputs. The Koreans are producing some very high-tech inputs, and et cetera, and et cetera. They send those inputs to China. Then Chinese workers assemble them into iPhones, into computers. Then they are sold to the US. So trade becomes more complicated. 30 years ago, it went directly from other East Asian countries to the US. Now they went via China to the US. So that's what happened. If you add up the trade surplus of China, Japan, four tigers to the US, the share in the total trade deficit by the US of these economies didn't change all that much. It's just that their shares among them, among China and Japan and East Asian tigers, the shares are reallocated. So that's what happened. So in this process, trade becomes more complicated. That gives a rise to the topic I'm going to talk about. That's global value chain. Okay. Previously, something is produced in one country, is sold to another country. We call that traditional trade. So traditional trade is something that is produced in one country. So in the production process, everything happens within this particular country. Then it's sold to the second country. So that's traditional trade. Of course, every country produces a lot of things for domestic consumption. That's the most important part. So for a pure domestic traditional trade. Then we have the global value chain. Global value chain refers to trade about what the product in the process of producing the traded product, something cross-country borders. The simple global value chain is something that is produced, say, in China, then it's sold in the US. In the US, it's reprocessed, so it enters into a production process. Then after it's reprocessed, it's sold to the US customer. So in the production process, the good already crosses a border. So that's the simple global value chain. However, now a lot of goods involves complex global value chain. That is, in the production process, products cross country borders many times, more than once. So that's a complex global value chain. So the traditional trade, one example of the traditional trade is a wine produced in one country, then it's sold to another country. An example for a simple global value chain product trade is steel produced in China, then it's used in construction of in the US, then after the construction, the house is sold to a consumer. Complex trade, complex global value chain. Very good example is the iPhone example I just talked about. China sources many intermediate inputs from many different countries, assembles it in China, then sold it to the US. So the materials crosses many country borders in the process of trade. Now, if you decompose GDP into these four parts, then look at these trends. So domestic, pure domestic consumption as a share of GDP went down quite a bit until 2008. Then it stabilized, there's some fluctuation, and then it went up and it stabilized again. Then simple traditional trade, the blue one, went up. The simple global value chain went up. Complex global value chain went up, then it stabilized. So that's the picture of trade. So global value chain is becoming a very important part of trade. With global value chain, trade statistics becomes very complicated. To get the true picture, we need to do a lot of exercise to decompose the trade statistics, as I just did before. Okay. Then what kind of products will go through this complex global what kind of products are more likely to go through this complex global value chain? And it turns out that some research is done. It turns out that high-tech products is more likely to be traded through complex global value chain. So in this table, we decompose, we look at different categories of products, and we can see that for high-tech products, global value chain participation rate is much higher than other category of products. Okay, so as I explained, trade becomes more complex. A lot of trade is going through complex global value chain. I just explained the importance of the concept of global value chain to help us better understand trade statistics. With the help of this concept, we can do more accurate studies about the impact of trade. And what's found is that the impact of trade on labor market has not been a significant contributor to decline in manufacturing jobs in advanced economies. So that's very different from what's reported by popular press or what's claimed by politicians. At the same time, trade also creates higher income. Higher income induces more demand for services, which in turn creates services jobs. So that's also found in the literature. And furthermore, the emergence of global value chain has offered developing countries opportunities to integrate into the global economy. For example, it would be unimaginable if China couldn't import all these intermediate products, such as memory chips, from other countries, and at the same time to be able to engage in the production of iPhones. It's the help of global value chain that helps a developing country like China to engage in such a highly complicated system of productions. However, although globalization has brought so much benefits to all countries, however, such benefits may not have been equally distributed within each individual country. Actually, for a lot of advanced economies, the gains from trade are not well distributed. So some people are actually hurt by trade. And this explains some of the resistance to globalization. It is quite understandable. So it's the duty of governments, of politicians, to better design policies so that more people can benefit from trade, so that people can support globalization again. And in the global value chain system, where is China's position? China has become a hub of global trade networks. Here I use, for the sake of time, I very quickly go through these charts. And here each bubble represents the importance of a trading nation in the system. As you can see, for traditional trade, for simple global value chain activities, and for complex global value chain activities, China's role has all been increased. So this is very good for China. At the same time, I think it's also good for the world. China is helping the world produce many things more efficiently. As a result, China has become a large country for manufacturing. This chart shows the share of manufacturing of some important countries in the world. And why is China able to become a hub of global value chain activities? And there are many reasons. Economic reforms, sometimes very difficult economic reforms, has helped. Opening up to the world has helped. Competition among local governments has helped. Low cost of labor. And a lot of investment in infrastructure has made it possible for China's industry to grow, to better integrate with the rest of the world. So as a result, China has developed a comprehensive system of industries, which makes it a very attractive destination for global value chain activities. I explained earlier how production activities moved from Japan, from 4 Asian tigers to China. I'm not going to repeat again. Now we are facing a lot of challenges. Part of the challenge comes from growing resistance to globalization. And COVID-19 also made it worse because people worry about the security of some, the supply of some important goods. So China and a lot of trading nations will face a lot of challenges posed by these anti-globalization sentiments. For China, diminishing labor cost advantage is another challenge. At the same time, even though our labor cost has risen, however, we are still technologically behind in many areas. So we are subject to pressure from both ends, from lower labor cost countries and from more technological advanced countries. And the challenge faced by China is not China's challenge alone. Actually, all countries face similar challenges, and it's not useful to blame each other for these problems. It's better for us to come together to find the true problems and find the effective solutions to all these problems. If we work together, the world will be a better place.